Caledonia Quinn had never meant to walk onto the Williamsburg Bridge that fog-sunk October dawn. But her L train had stalled underground, and her editor wanted pre-sunrise photos of the skyline for a feature on New York's Hour No One Notices. So she'd climbed the station stairs, camera bag thunking her hip, and decided 7 extra blocks were quicker than waiting on a temperamental subway. The East River lay hidden beneath a quilt of white, and headlights coasted past like fish in milky water. Somewhere below, a tugboat horn moaned, low and lonely, while commuter bicycles hissed along the bike lane. She framed a test shot, steel lattice fading into cotton fog, when a sound cut sideways through traffic, the thin, reedy wail of an infant. Her reflexes, tuned by years of photojournalism, sent her running before intention caught up. Boots slapped wet pavement as she followed the thin cry to a stroller parked, no, abandoned, against the pedestrian railing. It faced the river like a coin-op viewer, its mesh canopy trembling with each note of distress. She crouched, heart drumming, and peeled back the cover to find a baby maybe 6 months old, cheeks mottled from cold, fists flailing against a blanket tied far too loosely for fall wind. Caledonia's own childhood memories were all foster home corridors and donated toys. But instinct overrode biography. She scooped the child into her jacket, murmuring nonsense syllables until the crying hitched into startled silence. Fog beaded on the infant's lashes like dew. She fished her phone out with her free hand to dial 911 when a man's voice, velvet baritone edged with panic, spoke behind her. "Please don't call the police. She's safe, I swear. She's ours." Caledonia spun, tightening her grip on the child, camera strap whipping across her shoulder. The stranger stood a few yards away, palms raised surrender style, as if approaching a feral animal. Even through mist, she registered odd details. Clothes incongruously dry despite the fog, a sleek carbon fiber duffel slung cross-body, and eyes the color of wet copper pennies. Unsettling, familiar in a way she couldn't source. He stepped closer, rain-slick boots silent, and said the baby's name was Nova Quinn Vaughn. The double surname smacked into her gut like a door she hadn't realized was locked. Quinn, her own. She accused him of stalking, of staged kidnapping. He countered with a single fact no one else could know, reciting the serial number of the vintage Rolleiflex camera her biological mother had pawned before giving Caledonia up. The information jolted her so hard she nearly lost her hold on the infant. The man introduced himself as Orion Vaughn, and claimed, without irony, without the salesman's wink, that he'd traveled from the year 2030 through a temporal aperture set to close in 72 hours. Nova, he said, had slipped through ahead of him when the conduit destabilized near the East River. He produced a ring from his coat pocket, tungsten, scuffed, engraved inside with her signature, Caledonia's unmistakable, down to the flourish on the queue, but dated July 7th, 2028. Adrenaline and journalistic cynicism battled inside her skull. She demanded ID. He offered a driver's license from Greater Atlantic Union. Expiration 2033. Hologram shifting colors she'd never seen in DMV tech. The rational response was to flag down the nearest patrol car, but the baby, Nova, burrowed against her collarbone with a sigh of recognition that pierced through every defensive instinct. Orion's voice softened, explaining that in his timeline they stood on this bridge 3 years from now celebrating Nova's first steps. A rogue quantum experiment halfway across the world had glitched, tossing child and father back 6 years. He needed Caledonia's help to recalibrate the aperture using triangulation software embedded in a device inside the duffel. And if they failed before the 72-hour decay, Nova would temporal shift again. Destination unpredictable. For a blink, she saw the rest of her day as originally planned. A coffee scalding her tongue, a long lens capturing birds over Dumbo rooftops. A sterile office where editors argued font size. Instead, she felt fog dampen her hair, while a baby with her surname clutched her necklace, and a man who knew the secret of her mother's camera waited for her verdict. The city thrummed beneath, indifferent. Caledonia inhaled, tasting river and wild possibility, and decided that if fate was laying out a headline this outrageous, the least she could do was chase the story. She tucked Nova securely under her chin and told Orion Vaughn he had exactly 71 hours and 52 minutes left. He'd better start explaining everything on the way. He exhaled a laugh, heavy with relief and fear, then led them off the bridge into the waking city, where streetlights winked out one by one like ordinary stars surrendering to a dawn that suddenly felt anything but ordinary. Caledonia half expected to wake in her own bed with the dream still hanging like gauze in her mind. But the weight of the baby against her shoulder, warm and faintly milky, kept reality nailed fast. They emerged from the bridge mouth onto Delancey, just as corner bakeries were lifting their grates. The air perfumed with first-batch croissants and garbage trucks churning last night's sins. Orion guided them east toward a parking lot where the fog puddled ankle-deep. Sunlight had not yet burned through, and buildings loomed like cliffs in a drowned valley. He knelt beside an electric motorcycle whose mat shell looked grown rather than manufactured, pressed 2 fingers to the tank, and a recessed compartment slid open to reveal a slender tablet meant to be worn like a cuff. Its interface glimmered in symbols Caledonia couldn't parse, geometric notations and pulsing cardinal points that rearranged every few seconds. He invited her to witness the stability index, a hovering lattice that flickered from green toward angry amber, numbers ticking down from 291,000 seconds, little more than 79 hours. The margin, he admitted, had already narrowed since Nova's unscheduled jump, and each fresh fissure in temporal fabric shortened the fuse. They found temporary refuge in Caledonia's loft on Grand Street, a converted canning factory where exposed brick wore graffiti like inscriptions on a ruin. She rarely brought strangers home, but the child's sleepy murmur overrode caution, and Orion's presence felt paradoxically familiar, as though déjà vu had blossomed into a fully furnished memory. He paced while she brewed coffee, turning the mug in her hands to hide how it trembled. Nova dozed in a makeshift nest of fleece blankets on the sofa, her tiny fists opening and closing in dream, and Caledonia took the lull to interrogate. Orion spoke in deliberate, measured cadences, stripping away jargon so plain language carried impossible truths. In 2030, he said, quantum engineers at a collider on the Danish coast had lured the first artificial wormhole into partial existence, anchored by gravimetric resonance beacons positioned across the planet. The aperture's mouth drifted unpredictably, a cosmic jellyfish pulled by tides of celestial mechanics. But on July 17, 2030, it was forecast to bloom over New York for 4 precisely controlled minutes. And that window was meant for data probes only, not people. When the field destabilized, Orion was locked in a safety chamber with Nova, his evacuation route cut off by containment shields. Fatherly panic overrode protocol. He wrapped his daughter in an experimental compression harness designed for quantum cargo, slammed the emergency override, and stepped into a corridor of blue-white static that smelled, he said, of burnt cinnamon and electrical storms. The world convulsed, and he landed hard on the bridge catwalk 66 months in the past, the harness shearing away in transit and leaving Nova to roll into fog. He followed seconds later, disoriented, to find Caledonia already lifting the child. Proof, he knew, would matter more to her than pretty narratives. He produced a palm-sized projector that painted holographic recordings against the brick wall. News feeds in Danish and Mandarin, scrolling ticker data about the Time Aperture Initiative. A video of Caledonia herself, older, hair braided with silver streaks, laughing as she adjusted Nova's sun hat on a beach where the water shone a peculiar teal. The footage collapsed every muscle in her body. She saw the line of her own jaw softened by joy, saw Orion's arm slip around that familiar future her with a casual intimacy no actor could fake, and felt her throat tighten around a name she'd never said aloud to anyone. Nova. She demanded timestamps, metadata. He showed her biometric hashes keyed to her retinal scan, something current sensor tech could not counterfeit. The rational fortress she had built over years of skeptical reporting began to crumble brick by brick. Their uneasy truce was shattered by the sudden howl of sirens below. Caledonia peered through a grime-streaked window at 2 NYPD cruisers double-parked outside the building, officers gesturing at her front door. Someone must have reported a stolen baby or a suspicious figure on the bridge. The stroller, abandoned in her scramble, would have been damning evidence. Orion reacted with alarming calm, instructing her to retrieve any critical belongings while he initiated a soft wipe on the apartment. No fire, no violence, just a graceful erasure of anything that might rewrite history in the wrong direction. He tapped commands into the cuff, and the hologram folded into itself like a dying star. Caledonia's pulse thrashed. Every camera lens in the room felt like an open eye she'd have to rip out. She grabbed spare batteries, press credentials, her mother's pawn ticket Rolleiflex, then swaddled Nova and followed Orion to the fire escape window, just as a battering ram sounded downstairs. They descended wrought iron ladders slick with drizzle until their boots splashed into an alley where Orion's motorcycle idled, as though anticipating their flight. Caledonia mounted behind him, one hand clutching Nova, the other gripping Orion's jacket, and they shot out onto Grand in a surge of silent torque. No engine roar, only the hiss of tires. Police lights smeared red against morning haze behind them, but the bike slipped through traffic like a ghost, weaving between delivery trucks and hissing buses bound for Midtown. Caledonia craned to check Nova, who stared wide-eyed at city blur, then buried her face against Orion's back where the duffel was strapped. She felt the child's heartbeat against her own ribs and realized with terrifying clarity that if Orion was lying, she was endangering 3 lives. But if he was telling truth, she was already woven into a braid of causality no arrest could sever. They sheltered next inside the cavern, a shuttered electro-swing club in Soho whose owner owed Caledonia a favor, after she once buried a scandalous photo set for him. The basement smelled of stale gin and sawdust, perfect for off-grid strategizing. Orion spread a paper map, overlaying transparent grids until Lower Manhattan looked like a circuit board. He explained that the aperture would reopen here, at the apex of a triangulation formed by satellite-grade resonators he would assemble from parts in the duffel, coils of ultraconductive alloy, gyro stabilizers small as cufflinks, tritium cells whose glow pulsed in hypnotic rhythm. They had to plant 3 beacons, one atop One World Trade, one beneath Bethesda Terrace in Central Park, where geomagnetic eddies converged, and a final one on the deck of a Staten Island ferry, timed to pass beneath the Verrazzano Narrows at the exact microsecond resonance peaked. Last, they must recalibrate the handheld modulator Orion carried, so it matched Nova's unique quantum signature, allowing the aperture to lock onto her biological imprint. The plan sounded like a heist, pitched by a physics poet. But Caledonia understood deadlines and logistics. She noted ferry schedules, security patrol rotations, battery drain rates, her journalist's brain divvying tasks with ruthless efficiency. Yet, before anything else, Nova needed shelter, food, the simple certainties that anchored infants to a safe timeline. A nurse friend of Caledonia's, Pauline, managed a cozy pediatric clinic in Chinatown and owed her a solid. Orion hacked a courier manifest to smuggle them past checkpoint scanners, and soon they slipped through the clinic's rear door where Pauline, bleary-eyed from night shift, examined Nova under warm light. Heart strong, lungs clear, weight healthy. Pauline asked whose baby they were smuggling. Caledonia said, "Mine," and startled herself with how right it felt. Pauline supplied formula and a sling, winking at Caledonia's new role, then waved them out with advice on swaddling during high-speed chases. Outside, afternoon sun finally pierced the cloud deck, scattering gold across damp pavement, and for a heartbeat, Caledonia felt the day pivot around her, a fulcrum of choice. Orion counted time in quiet whispers. 68 hours, 37 minutes. They took the subway, less conspicuous than the bike now flagged on police bulletins, to Battery Park, where the Staten Island ferry heaved against its berth like a tethered leviathan. Caledonia juggled Nova in the sling, camera bag slung over her other shoulder, while Orion assembled the beacon using what looked like a metal tulip bulb and a lattice of luminous threads. He knelt by the ferry's forward mast, slipping the beacon into a maintenance hatch as tourists snapped selfies at gulls strafing the wake. At that moment, Caledonia's phone vibrated with a call from her editor, demanding to know why half the NYPD cybercrime unit had requested her location data. She ended the call, heart rabbiting, and asked Orion whether their future timeline included prison sentences. He said the quantum aperture had no bars, but plenty of edges sharp enough to slice destiny in half. Evening cloaked the city by the time they disembarked, lights on skyscrapers blinking awake in choreographed waves. As they crossed the terminal, a street performer played an avant-garde saxophone riff that spiraled upward into night like molten glass, and Orion paused, head tilted, seemingly tasting sound. He confessed that music traveled differently through temporal memory, certain chords dredging echoes of moments yet to happen. Caledonia felt an involuntary shiver, sensing the vast gulf between knowing the future intellectually and carrying it like a second heartbeat. They hailed a cab to Columbus Circle, intent on navigating Central Park's warren of pathways while crowds thinned. Nova stirred and cooed at passing lights, oblivious to the cosmic chessboard on which she was queen. Caledonia tightened the sling's knot, and whispered that tomorrow they would buy her a proper blanket that smelled of detergent instead of adrenaline. Inside the park, the night smelled of rain-soaked earth and tulip poplar. They slipped beneath Bethesda Terrace where the mosaic ceiling caught candlelit reflections from a street vendor's glass baubles. Orion located a maintenance grate aligned with subterranean rock older than recorded human settlement, and pressed the second beacon into muddy soil, its glow fading until it wore the color of shadow. A distant clock tower chimed 10 times, marking 64 hours left. Caledonia photographed the moment. Beacon, mosaic arch, Orion's profile lit by outlaw starlight. Not for publication, but so memory could hold what logic might later disown. Orion traced a thumb along the camera's grip, murmuring that in his timeline their daughter would learn to crawl toward that very camera, fascinated by the click of shutters. The tenderness in his confession cracked Caledonia's defenses wider than any proof could. She thought of her foster files, the blank spaces where parental histories should have been, and realized Nova's timeline might heal not only future breaches, but past voids. They emerged onto the mall to find 2 uniformed officers questioning passers-by. Description of a woman with a baby broadcast on their radios. Orion's hand settled on her lower back, gentle but firm, guiding her toward the park's darker margins. They slipped into the Ramble's labyrinth of paths, ducking beneath dripping foliage until city noise dulled. Caledonia's legs ached, Nova heavier with each hour, but the weight felt like ballast against the vertigo of world-tilting possibility. She asked Orion if future versions of themselves felt this afraid. He answered that fear remained constant, but love endowed it with purpose. Under a weeping elm they paused, breath clouding in cooling air, and he pressed his forehead to hers, a brief contact bright as a camera flash. He promised they were halfway to locking the year 2030 back into alignment, but warned the final beacon on One World Trade would be the most perilous. The building's security grid sophisticated enough that even stolen future credentials might trip. Present-day flags. Caledonia exhaled, glanced at Nova sleeping against her heartbeat, and replied that peril was just another word for assignment. A distant siren wailed, choked into silence, then resumed, a reminder that the clock would not pity them. Orion noted 63 hours, 11 minutes, then kissed Nova's brow with a father's desperation, and led them toward the park's western exit where the city's pulse awaited. Caledonia followed, camera at the ready, mind recalibrating angles and shutter speeds, but also rehearsing answers for a daughter who might one day ask how a photograph saved the future. Above them, clouds parted to reveal a sliver of moon, thin as a promise and just as bright, guiding their path back into the maze of lights where history and possibility now sparred for dominion. Dawn seeped into the west-facing windows of Caledonia's borrowed hideout like diluted saffron, turning the cavern's basement stage into a low-budget planetarium where dust motes drifted through angled beams of light. She hadn't slept, too wired from the evening's chase and from the steady cadence of Orion's voice murmuring calculations beside a battery-powered lamp. Nova lay between them on a padded flight case, half cocooned in an oversized Knicks sweatshirt Pauline had donated, small lips curved in a private dream. Caledonia tried to memorize the infant's every micro-expression. Mindful, she had known this face for less than 24 hours, yet felt an aching déjà vu with each sigh. Orion finally set his stylus aside and straightened, the glow panel casting sharp relief across his features, and announced that beacon synchronization now rested on a single point of failure. They had to breach One World Trade's data spine before sunset to piggyback its fiber optic pulse. Without that boost, the resonator field would lack the wattage to reopen the aperture, and the 2030 corridor would flicker out like a starved candle, marooning Nova in a temporal no-man's land. Caledonia rubbed grit from her eyes and pulled out the mental Rolodex of contacts she'd cultivated during a decade of photo assignments. One name hovered to the fore. Dante Price, a renegade installation artist turned event lighting engineer who routinely bribed his way into skyscraper rooftops to stage illegal laser projections. At 8 a.m., she called in a favor, fabricating a story about a guerrilla awareness campaign for neonatal health. Dante, still half asleep and intrigued by the words projection mapping on the Freedom Tower, agreed to smuggle them in with his crew under the guise of tech support for that night's corporate gala. Orion listened, impressed, then added logistical notes. Dante's entry badge would handle the turnstiles, but the real obstacle was the building's level 2 biometric gate to the telecommunication hub on floor 91. Orion possessed a bypass stick, essentially a future-grade skeleton key, but it required real-time coaxial alignment with the building's heartbeat monitor, meaning they had no more than 90 seconds once the stick activated before security AI flagged. An anomaly. Caledonia's pulse skipped. She had outrun riot police in Istanbul once, but never battled a skyscraper's immune system. At noon, Dante's van pulled into the loading dock, road cases packed with RGB lasers and fog machines disguising the duffel of quantum hardware. Caledonia, dressed in black cargo pants and a reflective yellow stagehand vest, carried Nova in a hard-shell camera backpack retrofitted with air holes and a noise-dampening insert. The baby gurgled contentedly, unaware that her cradle now doubled as contraband. Orion donned a headset mic, shaved his beard into a neat goatee to match the crew's all-access badges, and practiced casual banter about lumen flux and HDMI throughput in case someone quizzed him. Elevators whisked them upward, glass walls revealing the city splintered into shimmering geometry. Caledonia's stomach pitched as they soared past the 80th floor where wind buffeted the shaft, reminding her that gravity was not a guarantee, but an accommodation. The service corridor outside the data spine smelled of ozone and chilled metal. Security drones perched in recessed docks like sleeping bats, their red-eye sensors dim. Dante distracted the floor supervisor with an animated rant about incorrect DMX channel configurations, while Orion produced the bypass stick, an iridescent shard no longer than a popsicle stick, and slid it into the gate's reader. Lights cycled from blue to white, then pulsed amber. 90 seconds. Caledonia's heart pounded in counterpoint to the stick's ascending pitch, but the door sighed open. Inside, server stacks loomed floor to ceiling in phosphorescent twilight, fans whirring like distant surf. Orion located the main fiber node, unclipped a housing panel, and snapped the beacon to an optical coupler. The device's petals unfolded. Hungry, drinking laser pulses until its core glowed soft indigo. 70 seconds. He tapped commands on the cuff tablet, fusing the node's heartbeat to the beacon's frequency. Caledonia kept one ear on the corridor, hearing the floor supervisor dismiss Dante's theatrics and call for a random badge audit. 50 seconds. Orion's brow beaded with sweat as he calibrated phase offset to compensate for building sway. Wind shear at this altitude caused nanosecond jitter that could misalign the entire array. 30 seconds. Nova whimpered inside the backpack. Caledonia rocked gently, whispering nonsense syllables, praying baby noise wouldn't trip acoustic sensors. 15 seconds. Orion exhaled a tremulous, "Got it," pressed a final key, and yanked the bypass stick free. The gate's panel blinked crimson, but they were already slipping into the corridor, door sliding shut with a click quieter than a camera shutter. They rejoined Dante's crew just as a security duo arrived, scanning badges with handheld testers. Caledonia's heart plummeted when her laminate flashed yellow. Random secondary verification. The guard, broad-shouldered, jaw like quarried stone, asked her to state her employee ID. She feigned rummaging for her phone while Orion, 3 paces behind, activated the bypass stick again under cover of a coil of cable, reprogramming her badge with a silent handshake. The guard's scanner beeped green. Caledonia smiled, throat dry, and hurried after the crew, sweat prickling along her spine. Dante shot her a mischievous thumbs up, oblivious to the close call, then redirected attention to mounting lasers for the gala. Orion whispered they had synced all 3 beacons. Now the modulator on his cuff would triangulate Nova's quantum signature and predict aperture emergence to the millisecond. Window, 46 hours, 21 minutes. Back on street level, afternoon smog blurred edges of sunlit facades. Caledonia suggested regrouping at her editor's office. He still demanded an explanation, and she needed press credentials reprinted to stay mobile. Orion vetoed the idea. Every database ping risked drawing attention from agencies that monitored for temporal anomalies. Instead, they ducked into a Korean barbecue joint on Fulton, occupying a back booth beneath neon chopstick signage. While bulgogi sizzled on the grill, Orion calibrated the modulator, its holographic readout spinning fractal loops. Nova gnawed a silicone teether Pauline had included, drool gleaming on her chin. Caledonia stared until Orion gently nudged a plate of lettuce wraps her way, reminding her to eat before their next sprint. She forced down bites, mind racing through contingency trees. What if the aperture destabilized early? What if police flagged her passport? What if future Caledonia counted on present Caledonia not to break? Their quiet strategizing shattered when a tall figure slid into the booth opposite, moving with predatory grace that chilled Caledonia's marrow. She recognized the woman as Zephyr Hale, venture capital royalty infamous for hostile takeovers and rumored black-budget tech ventures. Hale's steel-gray eyes flicked from Nova to Orion. She spoke with a smile carved from ice, congratulating Orion on beating her to the aperture, but informing him that proprietary algorithms predicted his arrival. She produced a slim pistol, no bigger than a fountain pen, and set it on the table beside the kimchi, a silent threat. Hale's proposal was simple: surrender the modulator and the child. Her corporation would harness the aperture's next opening for unlimited patent leverage. Orion's shoulders tensed, and Caledonia felt every nerve scream as Nova chose that moment to giggle, oblivious to commerce of souls. Caledonia slipped a hand into her camera bag, thumb grazing the shutter release. Hale warned that a single photograph could not stop a 9-figure non-disclosure bullet. Orion answered by sliding his cuff tablet toward Hale, screen blank. She frowned, tapped it. Nothing. He murmured that future tech recognized only bonded biosignatures. Hale shrugged, raised the pen gun, but Caledonia's camera flash detonated first, strobing brilliant white, blinding in close quarters. Orion lunged, knocking the gun aside as it discharged with a muted pop, a dart embedding in the vinyl seat. Hale recoiled, eyes watering, and Orion upended the grill platter, sending sizzling meat and grease splattering across the table as smoke alarms shrieked. Diners screamed, chairs scraped, and, in the chaos, Caledonia bolted for the kitchen exit, clutching Nova while Orion followed, coughing through smoke. They burst into a narrow alley where delivery carts blocked the path. Orion vaulted one, hauling Caledonia after him, and they sprinted until the wail of fire suppression cannons and Hale's shouted curses faded. Safe, 2 blocks away, they ducked into an abandoned storefront tagged with murals of cosmic whales. Caledonia's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the camera. Orion inspected the modulator. Intact. He apologized for underestimating Hale. Corporate espionage in 2030 had blurred into temporal warfare, and he'd hoped she hadn't yet weaponized her curiosity. Caledonia laughed, breathless, at the absurdity of corporate espionage intersecting with baby formula stains on her sleeve. Then adrenaline collapsed, tears stinging unexpected. Orion held her, Nova cushioned between them, until her breathing slowed. He promised Hale would need hours to recalibrate, buying them precious margin, but they must relocate to secure ground before nightfall. Caledonia suggested her childhood foster home in Queens, now a defunct halfway house slated for demolition. Its utilities minimal, but walls thick and nobody watching. Orion agreed, and they caught the E train just before rush hour, blending among commuters whose biggest worry was weekend weather. On the ride, Caledonia leaned against Orion's shoulder as subway lights strobed through windows, and at each tunnel joint she saw their reflections overlay. Present Caledonia superimposed with older Caledonia from the hologram. Distinctions blurring. Nova slept, tiny fingers wrapped around Orion's thumb in unconscious claim. Caledonia closed her eyes, listening to the train thunder, and wondered at the geometry of fate. A bridge stroller, a stranger's copper eyes, a baby named after exploding stars. Above ground, twilight smeared Queens Boulevard in coral and indigo. They trekked 4 blocks to the boarded-up Victorian, where she'd learned to knot shoelaces and fake confidence. Inside, dust motes spiraled through shafts of streetlight leaking past cracked shutters. Orion laid Nova on a couch that smelled of mothballs, then rigged motion alarms using beacon sub-circuits. Caledonia fetched blankets from a storage closet that once served as her hide-and-seek haven, memories swelling like floodwater. Later, while Nova slept in a portable crib fashioned from stage rigging and quilt scraps, Orion and Caledonia sat on the sagging porch roof, passing a thermos of instant cocoa. The city skyline glittered distant, the Freedom Tower's spire winking Morse code only they could translate. Orion spoke of the future's ordinary marvels. Contact lenses streaming news, seawalls singing low-frequency lullabies to combat storm anxiety. Nova's favorite holographic bedtime story about tardigrades exploring Mars caves. Caledonia confessed her terror that a single misstep might erase those possibilities. Orion countered that time wasn't a single thread but a tapestry, and their job was to guide the shuttle through the right warp at the right moment. She teased him for poetic metaphors, but the cadence of his assurances lulled her until exhaustion claimed her head against his shoulder. He shifted to cradle her, pulse steady, counting the hours. 41 now, until the aperture bloomed, and vowed in silent litany that no empire, corporate or cosmic, would claim their daughters tomorrow. Inside, Nova stirred, perhaps dreaming of whale-painted walls, perhaps feeling the tremor of timelines knitting themselves in uneasy truce. Caledonia roused at the baby's faint cry, blinking at Orion with the dawning realization that parenthood measured time not by minutes, but by needs. She rose, slipped through the window, and scooped Nova into her arms, whispering lullabies stitched from remembered foster home melodies. Orion watched through cracked glass, hope and determination warring with fatigue. He double-checked the beacon telemetry. All 3 nodes pulsed in harmonious rhythm, like distant lighthouses calling a ship across warped seas. Now they just had to survive the final night, and the gauntlet Hale would surely throw, then guide the ship home. Caledonia settled into a rocking chair that creaked ancient lullabies. Nova's breathing syncing with her own, and as the old house settled around them like protective ribs, she felt the distant shift of future pages turning. Still unwritten, but no longer unimaginable. Sleep, when it finally came, arrived in the color of rusted velvet, shallow, uneasy, forever snagging on the faintest creak of the old Victorian's bones. So Caledonia surfaced groggy when Orion's hand touched her shoulder at 3:17 a.m. He had been running silent perimeter sweeps on the porch roof. Now his eyes glittered with the reflected glow of the modulator strapped to his wrist, and even before he spoke, she caught the metallic tang of adrenaline rising off him. The beacon telemetry had hiccuped. 3 nodes still pulsed, but the Staten Island unit's frequency had drifted 3 microhertz in the last 10 minutes, a wobble too precise for natural interference. Either the ferry's maintenance crew had stumbled over the device, or, more likely, Zephyr Hale's operatives had traced the quantum breadcrumb trail. Orion whispered that anomalies this early could trigger a cascade leading to premature aperture formation. A rupture that would yank space-time like wet canvas and fold the city along fault lines no engineer could map. They had 37 hours left, but the margin for correction had narrowed to a knife point. Caledonia shrugged into a threadbare army jacket that still smelled faintly of her teenage self, tucked Nova, now wide-eyed and alert, into the sling, and helped Orion gather gear. He packed only essentials: the modulator, a graphene data stick containing Nova's biometric hash, 3 battery cells, and a compact railgun disguised as a power drill. Future tech with enough kinetic punch to stop drones without fragmenting. Ricochet. The half-boarded windows offered just enough moonlight for them to navigate the hallway, where wallpaper peeled in ornate scrolls like abandoned manuscripts. On the landing, Caledonia paused, listening for sirens or rotor wash. Instead came an unexpected sound, distant but distinct. The echo of industrial hydraulics unloading cargo at Queens Midtown Freight Yard, 4 blocks east. Orion's brow furrowed. Hale's people wouldn't risk heavy vehicles so near residential zones unless they intended to move something massive or unstable. They opted to cut through back alleys toward the roar. Streetlights were scarce, and puddles mirrored the moon in broken fragments. Caledonia's boots sloshed through a tide of urban detritus. Crushed soda cans, flyers for long-closed nightclubs. But Nova remained surprisingly calm, blinking at shadows as though darkness contained familiar shapes. Orion shared live telemetry via her phone. The Staten Island beacon now drifted 6 microhertz and climbing, meaning someone was actively probing it with resonant pulses that could degrade its shielding. If the beacon collapsed, the entire triangulation would skew, and the aperture might snap open over the harbor where tidal shear would shred its margins. He suspected Hale had built her own rudimentary modulator. Though lacking Nova's quantum signature, she would still need the baby as a living frequency lock. The freight yard sprawled like a steel jungle under halogen floodlights, container stacks forming canyons that smelled of machine oil and sea salt. They crept along a chain-link fence until a gap offered entry, then wove between pallets toward the source of activity. A flatbed truck whose cargo was draped in thermal tarp, guarded by 3 operatives in matte black tactical gear. One man scanned the perimeter with a thermal scope. Another knelt beside a metallic tripod, encasing a device that hummed with the same indigo glow as Orion's beacons, but thrummed discordantly, its field unstable. Hale herself stood atop a crate, coat whipping, shouting into a wrist comm. Caledonia raised her camera out of reflex, then lowered it, realizing any flash would paint a target on their backs. Orion studied the apparatus and exhaled a curse. Hale had erected a localized counter-resonator, a parasite frequency that could hijack the fairy beacon and redirect its energy toward her position, effectively forging a counterfeit third node. The result would lure the aperture here rather than above the river, giving her private access. But the field would be lopsided, its geometry raw. If Nova entered the torn horizon under those conditions, temporal shear could scatter her across decades. They needed sabotage, swift and invisible. Orion thumbed a setting on the drill gun, lowering voltage to stun to avoid lethal outcomes that might contaminate timelines with wrongful deaths. He signaled Caledonia to circle wide with Nova while he drew attention. Caledonia slipped between container rows, heart banging against the sling where Nova dozed again, blissfully unaware. Rain began in tentative drops, pinging steel. Orion emerged from shadow, boot scuff loud on gravel, and the guards whirled. A blue-white charge leapt from his device, striking the nearest operative and dropping him twitching. Chaos erupted, shouts, weapons unslung. Hale barked orders, fury etched on her silhouette as Orion ducked behind a forklift, loosing another stun bolt that knocked a second guard into a coil of rope. Sparks flew from the counter-resonator as stray rounds chipped its chassis. Hale cursed, lunged to steady the field. Caledonia spotted a fuel hose snaking from a generator to the tripod mount. Inspiration hit like flashbulb flare. She crouched, camera still hanging, and crawled beneath a container stack's overhang until she could reach the hose. With a swipe of a multi-tool, she severed it. Diesel sprayed, choking the air with metallic stench. She fumbled for a flare from her camera bag, originally packed for dramatic smoke shots of the skyline, and thumbed the cap. Flame sputtered crimson. She rolled the flare beneath the tripod, then scrambled back, shielding Nova with her body. The hose ignited in a whoosh, fire licking upward, and the counter-resonator's hum crescendoed into a shriek as its circuits overheated. Hale screamed for a fire suppressant, yanking a canister, but too late. The device imploded with an electric snap, sparks arcing like angry fireflies. Orion seized the moment, sprinting toward Caledonia. Hale pivoted, pen gun drawn, and fired. The dart whizzed past Orion's temple, embedding in corrugated steel with a metallic twang. Rain intensified, hiss meeting flames as they struggled for dominance. Orion vaulted a stack of pallets, hand outstretched. Caledonia clasped it, and together they bolted for an unlit service gate. Hale shouted the command to pursue, but her remaining operative was dragging his stunned colleague clear of fire, and the freight yard's sprinkler system thundered to life, drenching everything in blinding sheets. Caledonia ran, lungs raw, Nova's weight a living heartbeat at her sternum. They emerged onto an access road where a municipal hydrant crew had parked a utility van. Orion hot-wired it in seconds, panels flickering on as he slammed the accelerator. Tires fishtailed through puddles, and the city blurred again. Caledonia glanced back only once to see Hale's silhouette, framed by smoke and neon emergency strobes, her fury palpable even across distance. Nova fussed at the siren echoes. Caledonia stroked her cheek and whispered apologies for every jolt. Rain followed them across burrow lines, washing siren wails into white noise. Orion headed for an underground parking deck beneath an abandoned mall in Long Island City, reasoning Hale's drones would swarm obvious safe houses. They parked amid mildew-coated sedans and killed lights. In the dark, telemetry updates flickered on the modulator. Ferry beacon back to nominal frequency. Central Park and 1 WTC steady. Orion sagged in relief, but warned they had triggered a bigger variable. Hale would escalate from covert sabotage to direct extraction. The remaining 35 hours would be siege time. Caledonia's hands wouldn't stop shaking until Orion wrapped them in his own, warmth diffusing tremors. She confessed the flare stunt hadn't been bravery, but knee-jerk terror. He countered that fear-harnessed could bend probability. Nova watched them with solemn curiosity, thumb wedged in her mouth. Caledonia wondered aloud if destroying Hale's device had already altered the future version filmed on the beach. Orion conceded it might, but timeline elasticity favored stable emotional anchors, love, sacrifice, over predatory deviations. She found comfort in the thought that maternal instinct could be cosmology's ballast. They dozed in shifts. At dawn, city sounds seeped through concrete. Garbage trucks clanging, skate wheels rattling on sidewalk seams. Orion calculated they needed to relocate Nova to the convergence site 2 hours ahead of aperture bloom to prime the modulator. Any earlier invited detection, any later risked missing the window. He proposed splitting up. Caledonia and Nova would board the Staten Island ferry again, its deck still part of the triangulation. He would infiltrate a rooftop in Red Hook to monitor Hale's likely staging ground. Caledonia bristled at separation, but new logic backed him. Divide targets, multiply uncertainty for their pursuer. Before parting, they rigged a contingency. If either missed rendezvous at Pier 11 by dusk tomorrow, the other would activate a compressed fallback. Caledonia to leap with Nova into the aperture, relying solely on maternal contact lock. Orion to trigger, an overload that would collapse the aperture entirely, denying Hale at the cost of stranding them. The choice tasted of ash, but possibilities were fewer than hours now. 29, 42 minutes. On a scrap of photo paper torn from her bag, Caledonia scribbled a note for future Nova. You were loved in every timeline, and tucked it into the sling's inner seam as talisman. Orion kissed Nova's brow, then Caledonia's. A fragile grace note amid encroaching cacophony, and vanished into drizzle. Caledonia headed for the subway, backpack swaying with Nova's weight. Underground, commuters eyed the sling, some smiling, none suspecting the infant anchored the hinge of epochs. She calculated route changes, double-checked escape ladders between stations, and rehearsed neutral expressions. Nova doozed, unaware of rails singing overhead. Above ground, wind shifted off the harbor, bringing a briny promise that the tide and time were racing toward an irrevocable crest. Caledonia adjusted the sling, straightened her shoulders, and stepped into the ferry terminal's fluorescent glow. Determined that if history demanded a mother to steer its next chapter, she would meet that demand with wide-angle focus and an aperture of her own making. Caledonia underestimated how brightly an ordinary morning could glare once she understood that every tick of the terminal's wall clock shaved seconds off a cosmic fuse. Commuters flowed around her in an indifferent river. Office workers with lanyards flapping, teenagers scrolling feeds, tourists fumbling ferry vouchers. Yet she felt each passerby thrum with potential threat. A possible Hale operative in borrowed skin. Nova nestled in the sling beneath her windbreaker, cheeks flushed from the humid press of bodies, and Caledonia adjusted the fabric so fresh air could slip inside without revealing too much of the child's moon-pale face. She bought 2 tickets with cash from a kiosk that still took bills, then moved toward the glass doors overlooking the slip where the orange hull boat bobbed, ropes creaking, gulls shrieking overhead like malfunctioning alarms. Every instinct told her to keep moving. Predators loved stationary prey. But the loading ramp remained closed until the previous wave of passengers disembarked. So she found a pillar near the vending machines and leaned, forcing her pulse to synchronize with Nova's slower, steadier rhythm. She texted Orion a single punctuation mark, the infinity symbol they had agreed would serve as heartbeat check, and waited. The reply came within seconds, 3 stacked tildes, meaning he was in position atop the Red Hook warehouse and had eyes on Hale's staging vans. He reported minimal movement now that dawn traffic clogged alternate routes. Hale's team would need river access or aerial insertion to intercept the ferry, which narrowed risks to drones or a private launch. Caledonia exhaled, letting her shoulders sag just enough to pass for tired rather than hunted, and rocked on her heels while Nova gnawed a silicone bead on the sling strap. Around them, snippets of mundane life floated. A man complaining about Mets pitching, a woman listing calorie counts of everything in the vending spiral, a child begging to see Lady Liberty close up. The normalcy felt surreal, as though the ferry terminal existed on a set built for someone else's story. When the boarding gate opened, Caledonia merged with the shuffle of bodies, scanning faces for earpieces or matching jacket creases. She chose a seat on the starboard lower deck, bench angled so she could watch both the stairwell and exit hatch. Nova perked up at the diesel rumble as engines engaged, her wide eyes reflecting slivers of sunlight slicing through grimy windows. Caledonia narrated the view in a low murmur. Tugs idling like metal bulldogs, the statue's copper torch glinting just so, half to soothe herself as much as the child. As the ferry eased away from the slip, she pulled the modulator relay from her pocket, thumb resting on the single toggle switch that would broadcast Nova's signature at low power, enough to maintain triangulation, but, she hoped, beneath Hale's detection threshold. On the device's tiny readout, 3 glyphs pulsed in unison. The Bethesda Terrace node, the 1 WTC fiber spine, and the ferry deck beneath her seat. A tripod of music humming an inaudible chord across space-time. The crossing began uneventfully, waves slapping hull, tourists elbowing for selfies against the railing. Caledonia even allowed herself a minute to switch the Rolleiflex to digital back mode and capture a frame of sunrise bleeding coral onto soot-smudged skyline, thinking maybe future Nova would treasure proof that this insane odyssey still contained beauty. The serenity shattered roughly halfway when an anomalous shadow flickered across the upper deck windows, followed by the whine of electric rotors. Passengers craned upward, murmuring about cool drones and security test. But Caledonia's stomach iced. She lifted Nova, maneuvered toward the stairwell, and glimpsed through the slatted steps a black quadcopter the size of a patio table pacing the ferry's starboard flank. Its matte shell stamped with a stylized Zide, Hale's corporate insignia. The drone's sensor pod tracked like a hawk's head, scanning for signature pings. Caledonia tucked the modulator into an RFID-shielded pocket sewn into the sling lining and hustled topside to gauge exit routes. Wind whipped her hair as she emerged onto the open deck. The drone matched altitude, 10 meters out, rotors slicing sea air into vortex trails. Crew members shouted, trying to wave it off, but the machine ignored them. Caledonia ducked behind a lifeboat canister, heart battering ribs, and dialed Orion. He answered on first ring. She relayed coordinates. He swore, said he could deploy an EMP slug if he lured the drone within range of his rooftop coils. But he needed a clear shot. Caledonia glanced aft. The ferry's wake curled bright white against gunmetal water, forming a corridor straight toward Red Hook's piers. She told Orion to ready the coil and began inching along the deck's perimeter, keeping lifeboats between herself and the drone's sightline. Tourists gasped as the machine pivoted, hovering above the crowd, but most assumed a stunt or film shoot, phones sprouting like metal roses to document the excitement. Caledonia had to resist yelling at them to get below. Panic would jam pathways she needed clear. Orion's voice crackled through earbuds. 40 seconds until coil fully charged. Needed the drone at least another 100 meters south by southwest. Caledonia calculated angles, then sprinted to the foredeck where a bundle of mooring ropes lay coiled. She grabbed a weighted monkey fist at the rope's end, made for lassoing posts, and swung it overhead once, twice, before hurling it off the starboard side. The rope unfurled, its heavy knot splashing 20 feet off, drawing the drone's optical sensors like cats to laser pointers. It veered from the upper deck, tracking the anomalous motion now streaming across social feeds via passengers' phones. Caledonia raced back along the deck's edge, slipping a little on spray-slick metal. Nova whimpered, sensing tension. Caledonia whispered nonsense comfort, her lungs burning. 15 seconds, Orion intoned. The drone followed the rope's trajectory, then spotted Caledonia again, accelerating with predatory grace. Crew finally triggered the ferry's security klaxon, a shrill wail amplified by steel bulkheads. Passengers screamed, ducking, scattering. Finally, useful chaos. Caledonia dashed toward the aft stairwell as the drone closed distance. Orion counted down. 8, 7, while she vaulted the final steps to the stern deck. Red Hook's warehoused shoreline unfolded ahead, Orion's rooftop coil visible as an innocent skylight assembly. She bolted to portside rail, lifted the modulator halfway from the pocket, flashing just enough signature to lure the drone. It surged toward her, nose lights strobing crimson. "Now!" she hissed. A bloom of blue lightning erupted from the warehouse roof, leaping across open air with a snap of ionized ozone that momentarily blanked Caledonia's vision. When spots cleared, the drone spun lifelessly, rotors slack, gyros seizing before it plummeted into the harbor with a splash swallowed by ferry engines. Relief came like a tide. Knees buckled. Orion's voice broke through joyous and shaky, but victory lasted seconds before ferry security grabbed Caledonia's arm, demanding explanations. She conjured a half-truth about hostile corporate surveillance, but officers spotted the modulator bulging in the sling and demanded she accompany them when docking. With Hale's men on the hunt, police custody could be fatal detour. Caledonia pleaded medical exemption. Babies' respiratory issues rushed to clinic, but their eyes hardened at weaponized drone, and one officer keyed his radio for Port Authority. She weighed the odds. Compliance might buy time to lawyer up, or open a door for Hale to snatch Nova under guise of legal transfer. Flight meant barricades and APBs. While the officers consulted superiors, Caledonia covertly texted Orion. "Plan Delta," he replied with a single word. "Ready?" As gangplank clanged into place, Caledonia feigned dizziness, clutching Nova and staggering. Officers reached to steady her, and in that distracted moment Orion, now disguised in a harbor maintenance jumpsuit, strode up pushing a medical oxygen tank on a cart. He flashed a forged badge claiming Emergency Pediatric Evac. The ranking officer hesitated, juggling radio bark and crying infant. But Nova chose that instant to unleash an impressive wail, face reddening. Orion produced a data pad showing fabricated orders requiring immediate ambulance transfer. The officer, more comfortable with physical threats than paperwork, cursed bureaucracy and waved them down the ramp into the terminal. They moved fast through corridors smelling of fried seafood, switching escalators like chess knights until emerging onto South Ferry subway entrance. Underground, hum swallowed pursuit noises. They boarded a downtown 1 train seconds before doors closed, slipping into a near-empty car where Orion removed the jumpsuit revealing civilian clothes beneath. Caledonia's hands trembled violently. Orion anchored them within his own, thumb stroking knuckles until breath steadied. Nova hiccuped, then grinned toothlessly, as if applauding their escape act. At Franklin Street, they transferred to a Brooklyn-bound train, emerging eventually into Red Hook's industrial maze, where Orion's rooftop hide still crackled with residual static from the EMP discharge. Inside, he powered a backup system and ran diagnostics. Triangulation intact, aperture projection stable, beacon drift corrected. Time remaining, 19 hours, 11 minutes. Hale's drone telemetry suggested she'd lost primary pursuit asset, but satellite pings indicated a private helicopter idling at Teterboro. Plan C, no doubt. Caledonia slumped against a packing crate, fatigue crashing now that crisis ebbed. Orion knelt, checking Nova's vitals. Pink nails, steady pulse, no sign of stress, and murmured a lullaby in a language Caledonia didn't recognize. Vowels soft like tide wash. She watched them, marveling at how father and daughter synced breathing, 2 notes resonating. As dusk bled purple across warehouse skylights, Caledonia knew sleep would be rationed commodity. But she insisted on downloading backup copies of every photo and telemetry log. If they failed tomorrow, evidence must remain that they had tried to weave the tapestry's threads true. Orion nodded, configuring a quantum-encrypted burst to a dead-drop server in 2030. Transmission queued for automatic send the moment the aperture reopened, regardless of who crossed first. Insurance, he called it, against history's amnesia. They shared protein bars and instant miso, last of their provisions before the sprint. Outside, river wind rattled corrugated walls. Inside, beacon pulses throbbed like distant bass lines, reminder that destiny hummed whether or not they rested. Near midnight, Caledonia set up a cot from tarp and cardboard. Nova fell asleep almost instantly, soothed by the subwoofer lull of cargo ships. Caledonia lay beside her, unable to close eyes, replaying day's Jeopardy frame by frame. Orion settled at a skylight, railgun across knees, silhouette sentinel against star-smudged night. He spoke without turning, voice low. If things fractured tomorrow, if hail breached the aperture, if cops cornered them. He needed her promise to prioritize Nova's entry over his. Caledonia's protest stuttered, but she understood the shape of sacrifice. She promised, voice ragged, then counter-asked his vow that if she fell, he would raise Nova in whatever year accepted them, telling her that her mother loved storms because they cleared horizons. Orion's head bowed once, solemn covenant. Wind shifted, carrying brine and possibility. Caledonia's eyelids finally sagged. Sleep claimed her like undertow. She dreamed of walking the Williamsburg Bridge again. Fog parted. Sunrise painting everything gold. And on the near horizon she saw herself older. Silver threads in hair, camera slung. Nova toddling between her and Orion. Fingers sticky with cotton. Candy, the future. Caledonia looked up, catching present Caledonia's gaze across impossible distance, and smiled the kind of smile that said we made it through. She woke with tears drying cool on cheeks, heart steady. Orion checked watch. 12 hours, 2 minutes. The world waited. Breath held. All they had to do now was outrun greed, outwit physics, and hand their child back to tomorrow. By sunrise, the warehouse's concrete floor throbbed with the steady vibration of container traffic rolling toward the docks, and every rumble threaded itself into Caledonia's chest like a second pulse. She had slept less than 30 minutes. Orion, none at all. He sat cross-legged beside a flat-screen jury-rigged to the modulator, eyelids freighting exhaustion, yet mind whirring in quiet overdrive, while holographic telemetry orbited his wrists. The aperture's predicted bloom had narrowed to a 43-second window, centering on 1903-17 EDT. Just after civil dusk, the river reflecting enough ambient glow to turn the fisher's margins nearly transparent. That invisibility would protect them from civilian spectacle, but it also meant any misstep could plunge a foot and a life into oblivion. They divided the final hours into micro-tasks. Caledonia created a burn phone network so Orion could ping her through 3 redundant relays. She prayed at least one would remain uncompromised. Orion tested the handheld modulator's shielding, reinforcing it with a makeshift Faraday sleeve, fashioned from aluminum insulation peeled off air duct panels. Nova's role required simple biology. Stay warm, stay calm, radiate the quantum signature that would tell the universe which coordinates to sew together. Caledonia packed diapers, a sealed bottle of formula, and noise-canceling baby earmuffs bright pink against Nova's dark beanie. Absurd gear for interdimensional travel. Yet motherhood, she discovered, clung to practicalities even when physics snapped its leash. Shortly before noon, Orion left to scout Hale's helicopter pad at Teterboro via traffic cameras. Caledonia, alone with Nova, tried to rehearse the next 12 hours as if storyboarding a photo essay. Frame 1. Board a water taxi disguised as a Sunset Cruise employee. Frame 2. Slip beneath Pier 11's restricted catwalk, where the aperture's anchor coordinate hovered 15 feet above river skin. Frame 3. Activate modulator as the Fayette Street clocks struck 19. Yet no montage could capture the wild card variables. Hale's wealth and ruthlessness, the NYPD's unresolved questions, and the river's own snarl of currents that might yank a raft off course if wind gusted even modestly. Caledonia placed Nova on a blanket and knelt, tracing fingertip circles on the small palm until tiny fingers latched hers in unbreakable grip. The baby smiled, gums glistening, and Caledonia felt a jolt of ferocious certainty. She would walk through fire, steel, time itself before letting Nova disappear into uncertainty. Orion returned before 2, cheeks flushed from the brisk bike ride. He brought troubling news. Hale's chopper had lifted an hour ago, but telemetry spoofers masked its transponder. Destination unknown, almost certainly the harbor. Worse, a federal alert circulated to all maritime units describing Caledonia as a person of interest in endangering a minor via industrial espionage. Hale clearly leveraged her influence to harmonize law enforcement with her pursuit. That meant uniformed patrol boats might unknowingly aid a kidnapping. They executed Plan Delta's next phase at 16 hours sharp. Orion wheeled out a battered Zodiac he'd stored since a photo assignment in Syria. Lightweight, outboard motor silent as an electric toothbrush. While he inflated pontoons, Caledonia fed Nova mashed banana, then strapped the child into a neoprene flotation bassinet secured to her own torso harness. She changed into a black wetsuit, layered under a dockworker's boiler suit. Pockets bulged with anchor pythons, carabiners, a waterproof sat phone, and 3 SD cards containing every image she'd shot since the bridge. Orion wore weatherproof cargos, Kevlar plates hidden beneath a ferry crew jacket, railgun holstered like a stud finder. They pushed off from a derelict slip in the Gowanus Canal, engines whispering. Afternoon light skated silver shards across water slick with rainbow oil eddies. Scenes flashed by at cinematic speed. Kayakers waving, unaware. A salt-stained barge dwarfing their Zodiac. The skyline sharpening like a serrated blade as they rounded Governor's Island. Orion throttled down near Pier 11. From here on, stealth mattered. They drift idled to a maintenance ladder bolted under the pier's lip. Caledonia slung Nova across her back and ascended first, boot soles finding rusted rungs. The crawl space beneath Pier 11 smelled of brine and diesel, echoing with hollow thuds of commuters above. Somewhere overhead, a busker's sacks painted lazy blues that dribbled between planks like molten lead. Worlds colliding, ordinary and impossible. At the crawl space's center, Orion unfolded a carbon fiber catwalk no wider than a cafeteria tray. Light enough to backpack, strong enough for footfall. He extended it over a gap where river slapped pilings, then knelt to calibrate the modulator's beacon mode. Caledonia kept watch down pier. A Harbor Patrol RIB idled 200 yards off, twin outboards churning white froth. Hale? Impossible to tell from silhouettes, but her pulse accelerated. Orion finished calibration and handed Caledonia a slim remote. Dead man switch. If he fell, she triggered beacon override, locking aperture on Nova's quantum ID regardless of adult casualties. At 1845, gulls wheeled low, anticipating twilight scraps. Commuter ferries dwindled. The world seemed to hold its breath. Orion checked wind. North-northeast, 6 knots. Acceptable drift. He clipped Nova's bassinet harness to his own, sandwiching the infant between them, then guided Caledonia onto the catwalk. Each step produced groans from aluminum joints, yet held. They halted exactly at the triangulated X, light sensors confirming alignment. Orion's wrist display counted down 90 seconds. He raised his eyes, copper irises lit by HUD glow, and whispered that no matter what vision of tomorrow emerged, meeting her on that bridge had always been the best calibration of his life. Caledonia answered with a tremulous laugh that tasted like salt and terror. 80 meters astern, helicopter rotors thundered. Searchlight speared dusk haze, sweeping until it speckled pier timber with blinding cone. Hale's voice crackled through a bullhorn, ordering NYPD vessels to stand down and promising safe retrieval of abducted infant. The patrol boat complied, engines idling. Caledonia's throat closed. Law would deliver Nova into the wrong hands. Orion squeezed her shoulder, then jammed the railgun against catwalk strut, firing a tethered slug toward the patrol boat's outboard. Electricity arced. Engines died. Smoke puffing. Pandemonium erupted as officers cursed, and Hale's chopper pivoted closer, downdraft whipping water into atomized spray that stung skin. Countdown hit 15 seconds. Aperture nodes climbed to resonant crescendo. Orion yelled for Caledonia to unclip Nova and hold her high. The portal would search for primary imprint. She complied, arms shaking as invisible static charged the air. Searchlight found them. Hale cursed, ordering a sniper to take out Orion's wrist device. Caledonia saw the glint of rifle barrel sliding from helicopter skid. 10 seconds. Without thinking, she raised her camera, firing flash after flash aimed at the marksman's optics. Strobe blinded shooter. Shot went wild, sparking off rebar. 7 seconds. Water directly under the catwalk bulged outward, surface dimpling like stretched membrane. A crack of teal light fissured the air, blooming into an ovoid gape rimmed by shimmering interference patterns. Color of deep-sea jellyfish lit from within. Heatless wind sucked inward, tugging Caledonia's hair toward impossible vacuum. Orion activated the modulator. Its core spun, transmitting Nova's signature. Portal edges stabilized. Humming a deep chord felt more than heard. Hale screamed over bullhorn, last chance to surrender, then swung chopper to hover above aperture, rotor wash destabilizing surface waves. Her door gunner leveled a tranquilizer cannon at Nova. Caledonia's thoughts telescoped. One twitch and the dart could send the baby tumbling. She glanced at Orion, saw him calculate same risk. 3 seconds. He kissed Nova's forehead, then Caledonia's temple, and unclipped himself from catwalk harness. Before she understood, he hurled his own body skyward toward the helicopter's skid. He caught strut with one hand, railgun in other, and discharged point-blank into rotor hub. Magnetic slug shredded composite. Rotor wobbled, then seized. Chopper lurched, tail rotor snapping. Pilots yanked collective, spiraling away from aperture toward riverbank. Orion lost grip, plummeted. Caledonia screamed, arm flailing to catch him. But gravity claimed him first. He slammed into water yards from portal, disappearing under churn. No time to dive. Portal sheared, flux wavering. Nova whimpered, sensing chaos. Caledonia locked eyes on aperture, tears blurring, and stepped off the catwalk's end. For a heartbeat, she felt nothing but cold spray. Then a rushing vertigo as body and child were swallowed by teal radiance. Light wrapped them, weight and sound torn away like old wallpaper. She thought she heard a roar behind. Maybe rotor blades exploding, maybe the river closing over Orion. But then came silence so complete it annihilated thought. A second, an eon later, sensation returned. Warm air scented with salt, and something floral, sand beneath knees. She opened eyes to blinding midday sun, ocean stretching turquoise beyond a dune. Nova lay blinking, unharmed, still clasped to her chest. Caledonia's cry came out broken, half despair, half relief. Orion was not beside them. Instead, a cluster of palm-topped structures flanked the beach, architectural lines both familiar and futuristic. A woman with silver-streaked braid hurried toward them. Caledonia recognized her own older face from the hologram. Behind older her walked a bearded man, forehead scarred, copper eyes unmistakable, limp in one leg but alive. Present Caledonia collapsed forward as older Caledonia knelt, cupping her cheeks, murmuring, "You did it. Timeline's intact." Orion scooped Nova gently, tears cutting clean paths through sun-bronzed dust. Present Caledonia tried to ask how long they'd been gone, what year it was, whether Hale survived, but exhaustion smothered questions. Older Caledonia whispered, "Rest. Answers can wait. She's safe. You're home." Present Caledonia let darkness claim her, trusting the arms that caught her were her own, trusting that some loops could close into circles of grace. The last thing she heard was Nova's soft giggle mixing with the hush of waves, proof that tomorrow had opened its door and welcomed them in. Heat drummed against Caledonia's eyelids before consciousness did. A soft percussion of tropical sun filtered through something that smelled faintly of coconut fiber. She surfaced slowly, as though swimming up from a lake of warm syrup, and the first sensation solid enough to name was Nova's breath on her collarbone. Steady, slow, unmistakably alive. Panic tried to claw in anyway, hungry for the second heartbeat that should have been close by. But an unfamiliar voice spoke with the same gentle cadence Caledonia used when lulling a skittish interview subject. "Easy. Your vitals spiked the second you moved. Let the sync finish, or you'll black out again." A cool hand rested on her forehead. Caledonia opened her eyes to a thatched roof ceiling, sun-bleached bamboo rafters lashed together with what looked like holographic filament, and beyond that, a sky far bluer than any Manhattan she had ever photographed. She turned her head a fraction and met her own gaze. Wrinkles fanning from eyes still bright, silver threads woven through a braid that trailed over one shoulder like moonlight caught in rope. Older Caledonia smiled, equal parts awe and maternal worry. "Temporal lag hits hardest on first leap," she explained. "Your neurons are trying to reconcile 2 decades of micro-differences all at once. Drink." She lifted a bamboo tumbler. The liquid tasted of salt and citrus, effervescent on the tongue. Nausea receded like an obedient tide. Nova stirred, then settled again with a sigh that melted some previously undiscovered section of Caledonia's heart. Memory sluiced back. Pier 11, teal light, Orion's fall, the roar. She grabbed older Caledonia's wrist. "Where's Orion? Did he—" The older woman tilted her head toward the doorway. Orion stood silhouetted, copper eyes soft, left leg braced by a sleek exoskeletal splint. A white scar ran from temple to jaw, but the smile was undamaged. He crossed the threshold and knelt, sweeping strands from Caledonia's face. "You caught the right slipstream. The portal spat you 50 meters inland, or I would have beat you here." And yes, he added before she asked. Hale's chopper crashed outside the aperture's influence. She never made it through. Relief detonated behind Caledonia's ribs so fiercely she sobbed once, then laughed at the absurd convergence of emotions. The hut's walls parted in sliding segments, revealing a coastline curved like a painter's flourish. Skyscrapers shimmered miles away, but their silhouettes were softened by vertical gardens spiraling up facades. Overhead, translucent kites the size of city buses harvested wind energy, tether lines glowing faint indigo. Older Caledonia eased Nova from sling to bassinet, and handed Caledonia a flex-screen slate swirling with icons she didn't recognize. Welcome to July 19th, 2030. 8 years forward for you. 3 weeks after my Nova got her first loose tooth. She tapped a file. Footage played. The cavalcade of yesterday's chase. The drone, the ferry, the aperture, edited from a dozen angles, overlaid with quantum readouts. You recorded enough telemetry that my Orion perfected aperture stabilization. Governments finally funded safe corridor research because the proof landed on a city pier with the NYPD as witnesses. Caledonia tried to sit. Vertigo pressed her back. Orion stroked her arm. Portal transit scrambles vestibular nerves. You'll adjust in an hour. He looked older by a decade. Deeper lines at mouth, flecks of gray in beard, but eyes unchanged, burning with the same earnest calculation. She touched the scar. He shrugged. Rotor shrapnel. Your future self patched me up before authorities arrived. A breeze lifted woven curtains. Scents of hibiscus and seawater drifted. Older Caledonia poured more sparkling drink and explained the quick and dirty physics. Their leap split the temporal trunk for milliseconds before remerging exactly where probability density would protect the timeline. Here, on an experimental coastal lab complex jointly funded by the Atlantic Resilience Coalition. We call it the Shoal, she said, a buffer zone where aperture research happens away from dense population. She gestured seaward. A lattice of pylons rose from surf, supporting platforms where technicians in agile exosuits shuffled instrument clusters that blinked neon under noon sun. Your arrival packet triggered every sensor. The council will debrief you tonight, but first, rehydration and orientation. Caledonia frowned. Council? Orion intervened, producing a slim ID band. Temporal Ethics Council. Multinational. After Hale's sabotage attempt became public, governments rushed oversight frameworks. Turns out corporate black ops make great cautionary tales. Hale herself, they revealed, survived the crash but was immediately arrested on charges ranging from kidnapping to quantum terrorism. She now awaited tribunal inside a Faraday bunker so dense no Wi-Fi signal could slip a bit. Nova mulled. Caledonia gathered her, heart stuttering as the baby seemed precisely the same. Yet the room's ambient sensors projected a faint halo around her form. Visualization of her unique quantum imprint, now etched safely into this era's. Baseline. Older Caledonia switched the display off to ease overstimulation. She's integrated. No more drift risk. Physical equilibrium returned. Caledonia managed to stand. Bamboo floor flexed pleasantly underfoot. She stepped outside onto a veranda overlooking cerulean water and white sand crescent. Ambient screens hidden in railing showed local tide data, real-time hurricane paths, and the shoal's renewable energy output. Orion followed, explaining that after the Pier 11 incident they'd lobbied for transparent tech. Public trust requires open dashboards. He smiled at her cautious finger taps. "You're touching your own legislation. Quinn Vaughn transparency hacks." The words dizzied her more than the altitude shift. Later, in a communal atrium carved into cliff rock, she met people she technically had not yet met. Dr. Astrid Liang, marine geophysicist whose holographic research Caledonia used to admire in trade journals. Inspector Mateo Reyes, the NYPD officer who'd once nearly cuffed her on the ferry and now chaired shoal security. Mariana Ochoa, the scholarship, cadet grown into captain of an air rescue drone squadron. Each greeted Caledonia like a legend stepping from pages. She realized time travel's strangest gift wasn't glimpsing tomorrow, but discovering she was already history. Debrief ran hours. They parsed Nova's biometric log, cross-validated aperture harmonics, and, finally, rolled up the modulator in archival crystal for museum display. Quarantine protocols mandated no personal retention. Orion surrendered it without regret. Replication studies were underway with safer safety valves. Council members voted unanimously to grant Caledonia temporal asylum. Her past self's legal identity, considered deceased after a catastrophic maritime accident, conveniently covered by the pier explosion. In practical terms, she was free but chronologically displaced, a minor bureaucratic miracle. Twilight slid molten copper across water. Caledonia, Orion, Nova, and their older counterparts climbed a ridge path where night-blooming shrubs exhaled vanilla perfume. At the summit stood a solar glass lighthouse, newly constructed yet weathered by design. Symbol, they said, of guiding unknown ships between epochs. Older Caledonia confessed she visited often, a ritual of gratitude. Every timeline, she murmured, needs its beacons. They watched the sun sink. Younger Caledonia, still grappling with the reality of her elder duplicate, broke the hush. "If I'm here now, what happens to you?" Older Caledonia smiled. "I keep going. Linear existence persists. We're branches sharing root data. Quantum decoherence ensures we won't fuse minds or implode." She tapped her temple. "But memories will echo. You'll sense what I know. I glimpse what you feel. Feedback loop fosters empathy, or migraines." They laughed, startled at identical cadence. After dark, shoals of bioengineered plankton glowed aquamarine near shore, tracing swirling calligraphy that spelled welcome in fractal spirals only drones could read. Orion fetched a picnic of kelp crisps and lab-grown mango. Nova gurgled approval at pureed fruit, smearing gold across her cheeks. Caledonia's chest swelled so sharply she feared ribs might crack. Joy, relief, and an undercurrent of anticipatory grief for the version of her life left behind under Manhattan rain. Older Caledonia, sensing it, placed a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't abandon that life. You completed its assignment." She pointed toward the shoal's distant towers where lights blinked like quiet applause. "Those structures exist because you said yes on a foggy bridge and kept saying yes." Orion added that preliminary simulations showed a 92% chance the aperture network would enable evacuation corridors for coastal cities threatened by rising seas within 15 years. Nova's sidewalk chalk will map wormholes, not hopscotch. Under constellations subtly shifted by 8-year precession, they lingered until Nova slept. Orion carried her down the path, humming a lullaby whose melody younger Caledonia now recognized as the one he'd whispered aboard the subway. its timbre unchanged by time. Older Caledonia walked beside younger her, sharing small future comforts. Nova's obsession with tardigrade plushies, how burnt coffee remained Caledonia's vice even in 2030, and a spoiler that 8 years together had not dulled the electricity. Between partners forged in temporal fire. Back at the hut, winds softened. Older Caledonia excused herself with a wink. Temporal etiquette discourages too much twinning in one domicile, and slipped through a side door, leaving the younger couple alone with their sleeping daughter. Caledonia traced the scar on Orion's face, kissed the edge. "You never told me if the chopper crash gave you that," she whispered. He pressed her palm to the healed tissue. "Worth the extra character." Outside, distant surf struck shoal pylons, a metronome for new beginnings. Before sleep, Caledonia opened the Rolleiflex, still slung across her shoulder through all turmoil, and exposed one frame to the dim lantern light inside the hut. She pressed the shutter softly, capturing Nova between her and Orion. 3 faces precariously balanced between 2 timelines. The exposure clicked home like the final piece of a jigsaw. Whatever tomorrow might spin, legal hearings, cultural acclamation, the ethics of living forward in time. This instant was proof they had arrived intact. She set the camera on a shelf and lay down beside Orion. Nova a warm crescent between them, and for the first time since the stroller's cry-sliced fog, she allowed herself to believe that morning could arrive without disaster. At dawn, gulls unfamiliar to her 2022 catalog sang raucous greetings. Caledonia woke to Orion's arm tucked over her waist, Nova still dreaming. Outside the open doorway, older Caledonia sketched the shoreline in a tactile tablet, stylus gliding. She looked up, eyes crinkling. Ready to tour the 31st century's waiting room? Caledonia managed a grin. After coffee. Older Caledonia tossed her a pouch of freeze-dried espresso beads. "Someday, I'll explain how we convinced legislators to classify caffeine as essential heritage." Laughter rippled through the hut like sunlight refracted by waves. Past, present, and future, converging in chords more harmonious than any drones. Resonance. Caledonia scooped Nova close, inhaled salt, sea, and mango, and stepped over the threshold. Ready at last not just to document history, but to inhabit it. Caledonia's first full morning in 2030 began with a sensory onslaught that felt equal parts documentary and dream sequence. After a breakfast of algae grain pancakes drizzled with lab-cultured honey, she followed Orion down a winding boardwalk toward the shoal's main research ring, a floating torus of pearl-white composite that rose and fell with the tide like a living lung. Beneath its translucent decking, shoals of coy, bright cleaner fish patrolled the kelp gardens, cultivated to scrub carbon from seawater. Overhead, kite turbines thrummed, their tethers humming an almost musical chord in the breeze. Workers in soft exosuits stepped aside to let her pass, offering shy nods that told her legend had preceded her. Yet none intruded with questions. It struck her that in 8 short years these people had built a culture where curiosity never eclipsed consent, a courtesy rare in the Manhattan newsrooms she once prowled. Inside the ring, holographic corridors sculpted from polarized light directed foot traffic without walls or doors. She simply walked until the floor glow changed from amber to aqua, cueing a gentle voice that said, "Caledonia Quinn Vaughn. Council, Chamber, Quadrant 3. Orion squeezed her hand. Reassurance that hadn't changed despite gray at his temples, then peeled off toward the engineering annex to review rotor blade telemetry. She reached a circular atrium whose ceiling curved into an iris of smart glass. Morning sun spilled through and pooled on the table around which 6 counselors waited. Inspector Mateo Reyes greeted her first. Uniform traded for linen trousers and a shoulder holster that carried nothing more lethal than a multi-purpose scanner. Doctor. Astrid Liang twirled a stylus, eager to dive back into subduction zone data but patient for politics. Attorney Leela Deshmukh represented the Temporal Ethics Consortium, her pinched smile telegraphing both caution and admiration. The others, 2 UN envoys and a Polynesian climate migration advocate, rose in sequence, acknowledging what she'd risked to stitch their timeline stable. The agenda sounded clinical. Ratification of the Quinn-Vaughan Aperture Safety Protocols, testimony regarding Hale's sabotage, confirmation of Caledonia's asylum status, issuance of a paradox containment vaccine, a series of micro-electrical pulses, meant to guard hippocampal synapses from overlapping memories. Yet discussion soon drifted from bureaucracy to philosophy. What does it mean, they asked, when the woman who authored the Transparency Acts is now 2 versions of herself, one with foresight of legislation she hasn't yet drafted? Caledonia answered in the only language she trusted, anecdote. She described the morning fog on the Williamsburg Bridge, the hush before a baby's cry rewired her priorities, the terror clarity of seeing time as a lens, not a line. I'm not here to guard secrets, she concluded. I'm here because a firefighter's bucket list taught a billionaire how to put other people ahead of profit, and because a stranger from tomorrow believed love could outrun probability. That story belongs to everyone now. The council ratified her status unanimously, each signature cascading as holographic petals across the table's surface before uploading to global ledgers. Mateo Reyes slid a data wafer to her. Full diplomatic credentials, biometric access to the shoal, a stipend drawn from a crowd fund that had blossomed the moment her portal footage went public. Caledonia pocketed it, half amused that she was now, technically, her own refugee. Paperwork ended. Liang invited her onto the observation deck cantilevered above the shoal's power heart. A transparent floor revealed wave energy converters plunging like enormous pistons into turquoise surf, each compression cycle lighting reservoirs that would one day feed desalination plants across drought-ridden coasts. Liang confessed she'd named the largest converter Nova, after the girl who inadvertently funded its prototype through viral attention. Caledonia pressed a palm to the glass, marveling at the ripple effects of a single infant's existence. For a photojournalist who once measured success in column inches, standing atop a continent-saving engine felt like stepping behind the lens of creation itself. That afternoon, Orion and Caledonia took Nova to the marketplace node, a shell-like pavilion of stalls stocked with hydroponic strawberries, biodegradable fashion, and artisan neural lace headsets. Children darted underfoot chasing hollow dolphins projected by street performers. A vendor recognized Nova by her wide copper eyes and insisted on gifting a stuffed tardigrade plushie fitted with gyroscopic legs. Caledonia captured the exchange on the Rolleiflex's digital back. The shutters click merging with vendor laughter and Nova's delighted squeal. Moments later, she uploaded the image to the shoal's public archive, where metadata auto-tagged it. First documented smile of Nova Quinn-Vaughan in stabilized timeline. The realization hit that her role here wasn't merely survival. It was witness. Evening brought a different kind of reckoning. Older Caledonia summoned her to a small amphitheater carved into beach stone, where torches burned clean ethanol flames. She greeted her younger self with 2 cups of heritage-grade coffee and a question. What do you still carry that you can't use here? Caledonia thought of her crumpled Metro card, the habit of flinching whenever helicopter rotors thumped. The hammer instinct to review every skyline for sniper nests. She named each aloud, voice trembling. Older Caledonia nodded, produced a palm-sized ceramic urn, and invited her to deposit tokens, literal or metaphorical, of any weight she chose to relinquish. Tomorrow needs your hands free, the elder said. Caledonia placed the Metro card inside, imagined laying down fear, and sealed the lid. Then her older self shattered the urn against a stone, shards scattering into sand where surf could claim them. Ceremony complete. They walked back in moonlight that glowed faintly purple thanks to anti-light pollution filters in the shoal's street lamps. Orion waited on the veranda, playing a steel tongue drum whose notes sounded like distant rainfall. Nova kicked happily in a gravity-balanced cradle that rocked itself whenever her pulse spiked. Nearby, Inspector Reyes and Attorney Deschmuke shared a bottle of kelp wine, watching bioluminescent algae paint neon freckles on waves. A softer version of the jazz ocean Caledonia once only photographed through fog. She realized community had sprung around her in less than 24 hours, knit by gratitude and curiosity more than by doctrine. Night deepened. Stars wheeled. Orion set the drum aside, tugged her down onto a hammock where they swayed in tune with rolling swells. He whispered that repairs to the portal array were complete. Controlled apertures would resume in a month under international supervision. Did she, he asked, want to visit 2022 again? Say goodbye to that life properly? She thought of the rent past due on Grand Street, of her editor still cursing missed deadlines, of a world inching toward climate tipping points these people already fought to reverse. She pictured stepping back onto Delancey, camera bag heavier but heart lighter, only to have to walk away from Nova's giggle and Orion's scarred grin. The choice, suddenly, wasn't between eras but between half-lives and a whole one. She turned, brushed her lips against his scar, and answered, "My past taught me how to see, but my future needs me to stay." His breath trembled against her hair, the exhale that closes a loop. Later, as they transferred Nova to a cot woven from sea hemp, the baby reached out, clasping Caledonia's index finger with surprising force, an anchor to this new reality. She dimmed the lights, sensors detecting lullaby heart rates and projecting soft waves across the ceiling. Orion joined her at the doorway, arm sliding around her waist. Outside, the ocean's horizon pulsed faint teal where the next scheduled aperture rehearsal flickered. Engineers testing safeguards. It looked not like a wound, but a promise. A door opening outward rather than in. Caledonia whispered to Nova about a bridge wrapped in fog, about courage disguised as curiosity, about the way love can fold time like a map so distant places touch. She promised that when Nova grew old enough to hold a camera, they would walk that same bridge at dawn and photograph the city she'd never remember but had once saved. She kissed the child's forehead, sealing story into skin, then stepped back to the veranda where Orion waited with 2 mugs of heritage coffee and a horizon brightening already with the first hint of tomorrow's sun.